C. Ritter was the principal, and it was he who dreamed a dream of the Fashion Institute of Technology, which was born, as you know, in 1944. And when I set up the placement office in 1944, I came over regularly to supervise it and confer with Dr. Ritter. And during that period, he discussed placement with me. I became more and more interested in the college. And so in 1947, I actually moved from my job with the New York State. I was a manager in the New York State Employment Service, a job I liked very much. And while I was very interested in FIT, I must admit that one of the reasons that I moved was that I could not work out a part-time arrangement where I was, and as Mr. Ritter wanted me to come, he agreed that I could try this out on a part-time basis. And so I moved into FIT in the old building, you know, where the high school was, in the fall of 1947.
Now let's stop for a moment and go back, because I'd like really to know how you got started in the whole field of placement. In fact, why don't we go back to where and when you were born and what you did as a child?
Do we have time for all this?
Yes, we do.
Well, I was born right here in New York City, and
in what year?
In 1913. And I guess when I was about 2 or 2.5, we moved out to Long Island, and I first to Hollis, and then moved to Jamaica. Went to Jamaica High School, then went to Barnard College, graduated from Barnard in the Depression of 1933.
Did you have any notion of what you would like to do if you had your choice, though?
No, I was really a typical liberal arts student. I had no specialized interests. I was very interested in working and having a career in a very broad sense. And when I graduated from Barnard, I was very fortunate in getting a job through the college placement office with the New York Times in a new department that was called the School Promotion Department. And I stayed there for 2 years, and it was a wonderful job. First of all, any job was wonderful during the Depression, but this was an interesting job as well. But the interest in it diminished somewhat in the second year, where it wasn't, I realized that we were doing more in relation to circulation of the Times than in the educational area. And so I left. And actually, I pinpoint that period to a very key development for me in my interest in the whole field of employment. Because really, at that time, I sat down and analyzed what a good job hunting campaign would be without verbalizing this to myself. But I really planned how to go about job hunting. And it really was effective. And the basic principles of that have stayed with me. And I can now talk about it very much more professionally. But I really did proceed along the lines that I later on advised students to do. So I was offered more than one job, one in the glamorous field of radio, but I also was offered one with the New York State Employment Service. Because it was the Depression, because I really had led a life where, while I knew about unemployment, I had never faced it, either for myself or with people I knew. And I thought it was a time for me to take that kind of job. It was supposed to be temporary. And I went in and I was working with young people primarily at a time where you might interview 50 people in the day and possibly get 2 jobs. Maybe they'd even only be messenger jobs, stock boy jobs. And I stayed with the New York State Employment Service for 12 years, getting more responsibility and getting a great deal of job satisfaction. I really had found a field of work that interested me very much. And as I have pointed out, I moved from there to FIT.
Have you developed any specialized area of employment?
No, one of the lucky things for me in the employment service, there were two lucky things. When I started, I was put in what they call the junior division. And way back then, the person who was the staff person responsible for the development of that program was very concerned about training, and we really had excellent exposure, very good training to all aspects of employment, career planning, and methods of interviewing. And so I really got a very good on-the-job training. I was able in those 12 years to, certainly if you're working with young people, as I was in the early, for a good part of it, you must be exposed to all aspects, because we were interviewing people that did not have specialized interests. So I learned about a wide range of occupations. And as I gained more experience and took more civil service tests and was promoted, I did have considerable supervisory responsibility. And my last job was in what we call I think it's now called the Apparel Industries Office, and I was there for several years. So I did come to FIT with background in that industry. But I think, Mildred, if I might point out one of the unique things that I think I brought to FIT was the very fact that I was not myself interested in FIT as a college for me. I didn't have any of the specialized interests in design, in merchandising, in any of the aspects that FIT is so well known for. And therefore, but what I was interested in was coming to a college that cared about placement and career planning. And certainly, I couldn't have found one that was more amenable to that than FIT. But I think that one of the things that I brought that was very healthy for the college was this broad liberal arts approach of not having students become over-specialized. The whole time I was at FIT, this was something that I emphasized in training staff, in working with students, and as much as I could in working with faculty. In other words, if a student comes in and says, I've majored in design, but oh my, I don't really feel that I necessarily want to go on with this. I took a course in, let's say, merchandising or something else that I think would interest me more. Or, well, I wanted the placement office set up so that there would be no problem for that student as to being able to try jobs in different areas. And the danger to me, and occasionally I ran into this with individual faculty members, where a faculty member who was very specialized and had to be might feel that that student was, in a sense, failing if she did not or he did not keep to the particular area of specialization that he had selected. Now, human beings have so many potentials for different kinds of careers that, to me, it's healthy to keep the options open. And that the training that we give people here at FIT is transferable to certainly within this broad field of fashion to different aspects. And that, I think, is a contribution I made. And the other one that I started right at the beginning was that I felt that the placement office had to be integrated into the faculty immediately. And especially when we were small, I was involved with curriculum planning, with not that I would ever have the final word, not as I wasn't doing teaching, but that I could give them the input from industry. I could evaluate and even test some of the ideas that they had by discussing it with employers. So it was a very good arrangement for me when I came, as far as being able to apply some of the principles that I felt were important in this whole field of career planning.
What was the nature of the school body when you first arrived on the scene? As I understand, there were about 100 students.
There were 100 in the yes. When I got I got there in the fall of '47. The first class had graduated in '46, and of course I knew about them because I had been visiting the school. So I don't know the exact numbers. It wasn't very much larger, a little bit larger. There were some very good students. The management program, which was a unique and new program in this college for the apparel industry, had some outstanding students. We were getting back some veterans. Some of them were older. We also had some very bright young ones. Careful recruiting had been done for this new program, so that we had some students, say, from Stuyvesant High School, from Brooklyn Tech, some very outstanding students, as well as some of these veterans. And as you probably know, from what you know of the college, we had the apparel design, textile design, and millinery design, plus the management. I'm trying to think of whether fashion illustration, I guess, was a major at that time too.
I don't know, but I think fashion buying and merchandising.
No, fashion buying.
Really,
Oh no, no. I'm very much aware when that was born. That wasn't born in 1940. It was later, a few years, several years later. In fact, we. Well, I guess we were still in the old building, but it was not in those early days. And of course, if you're interested in the placement office, like commenting on that, or did you want to talk?
I was interested in the student body from your point of view.
Well, I was very.
Were they young, middle-aged?
No, they were all young. They were all.
You
remember
mentioned
this
veterans of the.
Well, they were all young, except in the management program, and there weren't. The management program wasn't that large, so we weren't overwhelmed with veterans.
Right.
But I can still remember them. I could name them to you of some of the men in those early classes. 47 and 48, 49, outstanding, and who stimulated the younger people. Because believe me, when these veterans came, they meant business, and they wouldn't allow any fooling around. They had the students in the other classes. My recollection of them in the design areas was of a good group. There was a very good admissions director, Marion Brandon.
Yes, I should have seen.
Well, you certainly will meet somebody who was one of the founders and one of the key people in the development of FIT. And Marion's ability to select was excellent. And
but these were all high school.
These were all high school students.
There was no liberal arts.
Oh no, no. Well, I mean, they came with whatever liberal arts they come from high school,
right.
But this was way before the college program where we took on students with previous college. Mary would know better than I on this, but I do not recollect that we had any students at that time who had previous college. That would have just been a fluke. But I don't remember. And really, one of the lovely things about those early days that I got to know who all the students were, even if I didn't place them myself, because I placed only some of them, and had a colleague, Beatrice Zeeland, who was a teacher.
How do you spell Zeeland?
Zelin. B taught in the apparel design department, and she was assigned a half of her day to work in the placement department. And as she taught apparel design, it was only natural that she would be a person to do that placement.
Mm-hmm.
And she also took care of the millinery design, whereas I took over the management, which was a very special challenge to me, this brand new program. And
what kind of courses
design.
were given in management?
Well,
I'm not sure.
Don't get me started on this
Yes,
because
please.
all right. It's a basic engineering program as applied to the apparel industry, and it was the first such program in the country, really. And so they were not only pioneers, but the students who went out, but we had to introduce the idea to employers. And the placement was something that I watched very carefully and arranged with employers to come in so they could see the program in action and to carefully follow up with them the progress of the students. And
how many people were involved in teaching this kind of
well, when this program, there were 2 people in the management department at that time. I think one might even have been part-time.
Mm-hmm.
We had a very good, bright young engineer who was the chairman. Somebody had to be the chairman. He was, and then I think he hired. He may have been full-time or part-time. The other person. That's how it started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, for you seeing this large institution now, as you're talking to me, you know, I'm now envisioning myself
Yes,
back
right.
in those days.
Right.
It was an entirely different thing. And yet, you know, there's certain basic things that are not different. The management program is basically the same program. In fact, the fashion design program undoubtedly is, with specializations that have come from there, but the basic approach, I think, was started and was successful enough that it is continued as a core of FIT.
What was the percentage of male to female?
Oh, very, very female-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
The management, however,
Yes.
was primarily male. We wanted to have women then, and once in a rare while there would be a woman, but it was very rare. And just the same as it was very rare to have women engineers in any field. And this was the basic approach. It
Yeah,
was
right.
engineering applied to the soft goods industry.
Mm-hmm. So the 75 women, let's say, is that what you had indicated? 75 women to 25 men? Is that about it?
No, I'd say that the percentage was probably higher.
Higher.
I think it would be more 80 to 20.
Really?
I don't know. I mean, that again would be figures that would be easily found. There were a few men in the design department, few, but as the management department was a small one, even though there were males there, they did by far did not raise the percentage terribly high.
And the women, who are, I assume, for the most part, young women, came from a variety of high schools.
Right, but they were all local high schools.
And they
you
were,
know,
these were all people who really had decided this was going to be their vocation.
Yes, the people who came to FIT had a serious interest in design and the design, even if they didn't know all that went into what design meant, but they thought they wanted to be fashion designers or textile designers or millinery designers. And some of those specialized interests might have developed when they were being interviewed. Let's say they just knew, but one of the things that you'd find that a young woman coming in had probably made her own doll clothes. She gradually began to make some things for herself. She liked clothes. She looked at fashion magazines. That there were certain things in her background that related to this field. And you'll go into this with Mrs. Brandress much more carefully as to some of the things that she found and what she found were indices of their genuine interest in this field. But they came, and some of them came having liked this kind of field and not really liking liberal arts. And this was a way that they could go on to college, but not have to take liberal arts. And if I might divert just a minute, one of the things that I think was very exciting to me, again as a liberal arts person, without that specialized interest, was when students would come to me and say, almost shamefacedly, you know, I came in because I wanted, you know, the technical work, but I've gotten interested in English, for social studies, for the history of art, and I think I want to go on for more of that. Bully for them. Well, frequently they would, this type of student who would come in would be saying, now, if I go on for college, will I get a better job than you could get me now? And I never made it easy for them. Because, in truth, frequently, I could get them a job now that would be a good job. And so I would always turn back to them and ask why they were going on to college. And hope that they would be able to arrive, and I never said to them, if you go to college, you're going to get a better job. What I would say is, let's take in later years, a merchandising student, a good student who can get on an executive training program, a management student where I had, say, 3 jobs for at least for every good student. I can get you, I think you can get this kind of job right now. Yes, you could. Without going on to college. If you say to me, will I benefit from college? You have to decide what the benefits are. Will you say, in the long run, will the further education help me on my job? Then I'm going to have to give you a different answer. But if you're asking me if specifically now you're going to be able to get a good job, the answer is yes. And therefore you have to look at college in a different way. And I think this is the way I feel that this is the way students should, that they don't have to be embarrassed about wanting to learn more. Yes, and that's really what going to college is. And in the long run, it would help their career. And of course there are places immediately who say, we'll only take a 4-year graduate.
Sure, Macy's, for example.
Yeah, but that was one of the things that I worked very, very hard when the merchandising department started. It was the first thing I did, because I talked this over with the president before Jeanette Jarno was here or anything. We talked about this program, and I knew enough about the executive training programs to know that with all the great ideas that everybody had, to get a 2-year college student into an executive training program was very, very difficult, if at all possible at that stage. So I said the first thing I wanted them to do was to invite all of the personnel people, and I knew a good many of them, to a breakfast where we presented the program. And I, at that point, offered to come around and see each of the stores individually. I asked them if they would invite me so that I could explain what the program was and how we were going to work. And as I did that, and many of them did invite me, I asked this of the stores. I said, if you interview 2 people, one is a 2-year college graduate and one is a 4-year college graduate, And the four-year college graduate seems more mature to you, has a more outgoing personality that you feel is necessary for your program, has at least as good grades or better than the other. I would be very surprised if you didn't hire that student over the other. All I ask is that you interview them individually. And I will bet you that some of our two-year graduates will measure up in maturity, in the depth of their interest. You see, the thing that I had to sell from FIT was that these merchandising students were vocationally mature. They had selected this field. They knew by the time they graduated, really much more clearly than many of the liberal arts graduates that these stores were hanging their tongues out to get. And it was really on that basis that gradually I began to get the stores. Because when they really approached them as individuals, they did find that we had some outstanding ones. Even occasionally Macy's. Very rarely. But and Bloomingdale's. Bloomingdale's, Macy's, and A&S's were the three toughest. And A&S's we were able, again, it depends on the personnel people and how closely we could work, and we worked particularly closely with A&S's and were able. And what they began to find was that these students were outstanding, that they were good in selecting. They didn't take people who didn't have great retention. So that this is a long way around of answering your question about, the type of student. But gradually, you see, as we grew, we got students who became interested in pursuing college, and naturally had some of these doubts as to whether they should or they shouldn't. And a good many of them, I think, I'm so pleased to say, did continue and went on to get not only their bachelor's degrees, and some went on beyond that.
In the first years, let's say the first 5 years after you had started this program of placement, can you remember or can you identify the areas in which they were most successful at being placed? Was it manufacturing or apparel or fabric manufacturers, or which kinds of people?
Well, again, you see, there would be there were more people who studied in the apparel design. That was the largest program, so that there would be more who would be successful just proportionately. But you see, within each group, we developed, did everything possible to develop jobs in all areas. And so that there would be people, a certain percentage, that would be successful in all areas. We started, we did a follow-up right from the beginning of our students, and so we did have a pretty good record of what happened to them. And I can't give you...
Are those records still alive?
Oh, I hope so. And the basic program has continued. Of follow-up. And see, one of the things that happens when you start on a small scale and you don't have adequate staff. We didn't have any. I didn't have a secretary or a clerk. We occasionally had students gave a certain amount of time, I think 2 hours a week, and once in a while we would get a student who would come to the office, and I would have them address envelopes and But what I established right away was that there are certain basic things that are to me, essential in placement. But you cannot do placement without counseling, without job development, and without follow-up. And I was determined that I was going to do that right away. Now, we had no staff to do any of these things, so therefore I had to devise ways of doing things with a minimum of clerical work. So I devised what I called my employment calendar letter, which could be Xeroxed. And people said to me, you can't send out something that looks, it's not beautiful, it's not well printed. I said, we can't afford more. but this is the best we can do, and the content is all right,
Mm-hmm.
and this is what we're going to send out. So that when a student came through, I'd say, do you have time now to address 25 envelopes, you see? Then 25 employers
Yeah.
would get. And I established our statistical method. See, don't forget I came from the government where keeping
Yeah.
records of placements were very important. But I could discard the 25 carbons I used to have to keep and just do what I felt we needed. And so we devised methods that...
25 carbons you had to keep when you were working for the government.
Well, I'm joking.
Yeah, no, I'm serious.
But
I'm
not
serious,
25.
yeah.
But I would say certainly 6 or 7
Yeah,
times.
sure.
But here, I had to devise a system that a counselor, I could keep, and B. Zillan, that was the staff, so that I had records, but that it wouldn't take up too much of our
Mhm.
time. And similarly with follow-up. I insisted that we do follow-up of our placements immediately. And so again, this is the basic
So that you
system.
be sure that you're...
Well, first of all, I do not think anybody in my field can justify being in this without knowing what has happened to people you place. Now, you can't do this on a perfect scale, but one of the things that I feel you should do is to be in touch with students certainly a year after they have been out. So it's for 2 reasons: to find out what they're doing and to extend a hand if they need help. And so I devised a double postcard so that it was simple to fill out. It was printed, of course, with what we needed, and they could easily send it back. If they did not respond, we would send another one. And then if they didn't respond, we'd get on the phone. We might stay there in the evening, each of us, till we got, and I would not settle for less than at least 90% return, which is not, really, believe me, is something that I think is a minimum that people should do. So the basic things that we
Still
did...
sounds like a lot more than most
Well,
schools
unfortunately,
that
a lot don't do it, but that doesn't give us no credit, give them discredit. This is really very basic in doing a decent job in placement. So those, the advantage of starting without help is that you must devise schemes to do these things with the least possible help. And I really think that some of those, I know that as we expanded and as we had staff and as we got clerical help and as I had a secretary, those basic things had worked. And while I improved them and our promotional material looked much prettier, the basic principles that we followed, we continued. And I think that say this about placement, but I think this is true probably within all of the departments, that you establish a certain core of doing things, and if it works, you can improve on it, you can expand it. But to make this college work with the faculty and highly limited clerical staff, I think all of us had to devise ways that would be very practical. And I think this is good that people have to do it that way.
And then, so that they really know what's going to be done by somebody else.
Not only that, but that you learn to make things lean, not have unnecessary steps.
How did you go about this? Take a directory of the apparel market and then write to everybody in the apparel market?
Well, we did different things. Our trade is so. First of all, the college itself had contacts. We had excellent people on the board. We had Mortimer Ritter himself knew almost everybody in the industry who was a key person, and so we had a lot of source material. Trade associations were very important. And it was a visiting kind of college. People would come in, and I was always invited to meet them so that I would have other, direct ways. And I was encouraged by the president to invite people for lunch, and that was such a handy thing. I could invite them to lunch, and as we grew, I encouraged all of my staff to do this. When you can get an employer away from his premises, I used to say to an employer, give me an hour and a half. I'll feed you, I'll take you around and show you the college in action. I can even arrange some interviews for you. If he wanted many interviews, the hour and a half would have to be extended.
Yes.
But I could, and he was away from his telephone. And so was I when I was taking him around. So that it was a nugget of time that was useful. Also, we went out into industry. Ideally, I would like to visit I'm talking about as if I'm still doing it.
Right, yes.
I would like to have visited every employer on his premises. I would like every employer to have visited us. That was not possible, but we did as much of that as was possible. And therefore, particularly with a new program, you've got to get the employers to understand what's going on. And FIT, even in those 2 floors that we had, was such a wonderful place to show off.
Right.
I mean, the students were so interested that it showed. And as you took people around, they felt some of the enthusiasm.
At what point did you begin to add staff? Because you've now mentioned staff.
Well, you know,
approximately.
gradually. Well, you know, when you ask that, it strikes me so funny. When I arrived, I'd had a pretty big staff when I was in the employment service, and I had my own secretary, I had a statistical clerk. I really had some people to do some work. So I come to FIT, and I wanted to have a letter typed. I would say something is going out to an employer. Obviously, I didn't even have a typewriter. So my question was, and I went to Dean Snyder. You might know you will interview if you haven't. Well, I don't have to tell you how important she was then to the college. And my question was, at one point, I would have so-and-so would type this letter, but at another time there'd be another person. And that became a little bit awkward, as once I got into the work, there was, I developed more work. And so needless to say, I was longing to have a secretary. And finally I prevailed, and we had one. We got one. And that was a great, great help. Well, as the college was increasing the number of students it was taking in, obviously there was more work for the teachers, and even for the placement office, which I had to keep reminding them. More students meant more development of jobs, more interviewing, because every student had to have considerable attention. It wasn't just one interview, it was a continuing relationship. So we gradually got more. Then, of course, when the merchandising department started, that was quite it was a small group. I think it was 18 or 20 at the beginning. I can see these students.
18 or 20 students?
Yes. In that first class that's graduating, I can still see them. I can still remember some of the students. And so then I was able to get as a counselor. So how would I add a counselor? I went to Rosalind Snyder and said, Rosalind, how much money can you squeeze out so I can hire a counselor? I have to start with the money and then work backward. Well, believe me, the money was so small, that what I then decided I needed, we obviously couldn't get an experienced counselor, that I would take a college graduate. If she had graduate work, fine, but if she didn't, there was certain evidence that I could find that was of interest in this field, that I would hire her and train. And so I did. And this was, the beginning, and I think it was probably typical of other departments. And then, over the years, expansion of student body meant expansion of faculty departments. And gradually we became, as a college, more recognized. We became I suppose, budgets became more substantial.
Right.
And so we were gradually able to increase staff. Never enough, for your department.
Sure.
That's always you always feel you could use more. But gradually we were able to assemble enough people to do what I considered the absolutely basic necessity for a placement office in this college, and that was that every student would have a counselor, a placement counselor, to whom he or she could come, could have a relationship developed well before graduation. The work-study program was endemic to each of the majors at that point, so that there was a great deal of time spent with students, preparing them for co-op.
Was co-op a general?
And when we started, co-op was part of every major.
Really?
Yes.
That's wonderful. That hasn't continued,
No,
however.
no, but it continued a long time, and it was a very important part of the college development.
Why did
And-
it stop?
Well, it's a very I don't know if it's been completely stopped. I mean, I've been away for 11 years, so
I've never
I
heard of it
assume.
going on.
Oh yes, I assume
Not
it must.
recently.
It must be going on in merchandising. I can't believe it isn't. But if it isn't, then
Oh, there is some kind of an office.
well, there are
that does
some now. They do
arrange-
have internship programs, and I guess those are non-paid.
Advertising,
And
yeah,
yes,
that's
and
right.
I'll tell you one of the reasons. It's very, very difficult to develop paid jobs for as many of the students as they have now. That's really the basic reason. But this was one of the things that we struggled very hard to do. And one of the questions I asked when I first came, before I came, I asked the President Ritter, what happens when a student is not placed on co-op? So his answer was, well, they were all placed. Now, I didn't argue with him. Are we doing too much? I didn't argue with him because, as a placement person, I know there is no such thing as 100% placement. It is not possible that everybody is, always placed all the time. And so I thought, well, I will conclude from that there's a high percentage of people placed, and they hadn't had that many students, so I'll find out for myself. And I did. And I found what I knew, that there would be, if your co-op period starts on a particular date, and you have wanted a certain kind of job and couldn't get it, maybe you were not flexible enough to take another, whatever it was, or maybe there weren't enough jobs. There would be some who were not working. So one of the things that I started then, when the college was small, I had students come in when they weren't working, and we had job hunting discussions. I had them going out doing job hunting and reporting back. I considered this a perfectly acceptable part of co-op. It's only harder than working, is job hunting. From that, because I feel so, unfortunately, job hunting is something that most people do not know how to do. And I felt that where we could put forth efforts to assist students in this was a contribution. So one of the things that I started, not immediately, but a few years later, I wanted every student to have a resume prepared by the time he was or she was ready for interviews. And this was particularly important when we got to the point where we had on-campus recruitment, which started really particularly with the merchandising students, when I would get a lot of stores in, but then I would have management employers coming and other employers too, once we got it going. And it was very important for them to have a resume. And so I expected myself and each counselor to work with students. They were to bring in a draft of a resume. We would go over it never write it for them, but to go over it, give them a critique, and then they would have their final resume ready. And as I've said always about resumes, it isn't just the written paper. That's a handy tool. But if you've really done your homework in preparing a resume, you are therefore better prepared for job hunting.
Mm-hmm.
You know the story of yourself in relation to what you want. Attempting to clarify what your goal is. Because you want to put it down on paper, but you have to think about it first, don't you? So that all those things were very time-consuming for the counselors, but I felt it was absolutely necessary. Now, whether this can go on when you have thousands of students is another thing. And while a good many of the counselors who were there, including the placement director, I hired and trained, and I still have some connections with them. I think basically some of the same approaches are there. I can't tell you whether all the procedures are there, but they've had to make changes. They should make changes. You change as you grow. But what I hope is still there is what I've always said. When I first got there, I knew every student. But as we got larger, I couldn't know I knew the students I worked with. But when somebody would say to me, "Do you know so-and-so?" And I'd say, "No, I don't. But there is a counselor there who does." I felt, as the college grew, I felt that our job in the placement department was to adapt and adjust our procedures, because obviously there had to be changes with this, for us, great increase in student body, without losing the individual approach to the student. Because when you think about getting a job, or problems on a job adjustment problems, we continue to work with graduates, as you know, you think about this as an individual, and you need individual counseling for this. And so that was the effort in the placement department, to adjust the procedures so that we could handle the increase, at the same time never lose sight of the fact that each individual student required the same attention that those first 100 students needed and got way back in 1944.
What was your policy about seeing people after they had been graduated and placed in jobs?
Always open. Always open.
For how many years after?
Forever.
Forever?
Forever.
In other words, a student could come back who had been in school 20 years earlier.
Oh, the students could come back forever.
Uh-huh.
And many of them did, and many of them became employers and came back to hire, too, which was always very gratifying. No, we felt that the placement office was open always to graduates, and we wanted them to use the placement office. And as I said, one of the great things was we also developed from this employers who they came and hired FIT students.
When the school was very small at the beginning, were you able to have some input as far as curriculum was concerned, especially if it turned out that some graduates going out were finding that something was inadequate in their training? Did that happen?
Well, one of the things that we found, for example, I mentioned follow-up studies. After I had been there a while, when the first group of students had been out for 3 years, I felt we could do a more elaborate follow-up study than we're doing on this every year basis. And one of the things that we did was to ask them to evaluate the curriculum within each of their majors. And we did get feedback on that. And the curriculum, this particular part, the rest of the material, of course, was kept for the placement office, but we separated this page out and discussed it with the dean, and in turn it was discussed with each of the chairmen of the respective departments. I don't remember all of the suggestions. We asked them to evaluate it positively and negatively so that you got some of the curriculum would be measured as particularly helpful, some medium helpful, so forth. And I can remember that the curriculum in pattern making was actually affected by that follow-up study, because the chairman found it very useful, very helpful what the suggestions were made by the graduates. And
of course, in this era of high technology, there must have been some dramatic happenings in the market.
well, that's later.
Yeah,
You were
yes,
asking in the
yes,
early
yes,
days.
I tried the early days, sure.
Remember, I've been retired for 11 years. A great deal of high technology has happened in those
right,
years.
sure.
But I think that when I said I used to meet with chairman at different times. For example, if a new curriculum was to be developed, I was always invited to participate in discussing it, because naturally the college was interested in what were the placement opportunities in the field. And I would explore them for the faculty, for the chairman, for the president, and bring back the kind of thing. And of course they too would be bringing in people. We really worked together to try to do this. And of course, I think there were informal things that happened too. Graduates would come back to see us, but they would also go back to see the faculty and sometimes drop comments that might have stirred a thought in the minds of the faculty. And many of the faculty were from industry and continued contacts with them, so that I guess they got ideas that way too.
Now, coming up to more recent times, because you were there until '73, were there any dramatic happenings in the '50s to compare with the dramatic happenings at other colleges in the '60s, which apparently did not happen here? I'm thinking of the '60s with the unrest, which apparently did not impact FIT.
Yes. Mostly the other colleges were giving more evidence of student activity on social and political grounds, but gradually FIT students became interested, and during the Vietnam War they showed definite interest, certainly after Kent State. During the, what I remember is during
It's
the...
on now.
I particularly remember, get the name of the office, I think it was Urban Affairs Office we established. It was after affirmative action became...
Was it Bill Tatum who was the head of it?
No.
No.
I was on committees with students. I was delighted to find this interest on the part of minority students and of white students working with them. And it's one of the poignant things I remember. I'd been on a committee with some students whom I'd worked with enough that I felt we really knew each other. And one of them, who was at the point of working with the placement office too, knew me in both connections, through the placement office and on this committee. And so when she came in one day, I said I'd like to talk to her. In our placement office, we had an all-white staff. And I was interviewing at that time people for a counselor. And I was really quite troubled because I really would have been very glad to have a black person on my staff. And I had interviewed some black people, and I'd interviewed, it was a good job, and we had quite a few applicants, and I'd interviewed a number of white people.
Of black people.
I had interviewed white and black, but
right.
more white. And I was getting down to making a decision, and there was a black person I was considering, but I did not feel she was as qualified as the white person that was very high on the list. And I said to this young black girl, I didn't tell her that I had the problem, but I said to her, how do you feel about coming into this office and seeing that there are no black people here? She said, well, I would like to see the black person. So I said, well, I would too, but tell me, do you want me to go ahead and hire a black person, particularly as a black person? She said, I'll tell you what, Mrs. Fried, I'd like to see one. Get me a black Mrs. Fried, fine. Get me a counselor I can relate to the way I can relate to you. But if not, if she isn't as good as the white people you're interviewing, get me the white counselor. You know, that was one of the most moving interviews I'd had. And
I'm just a little confused. Is this a student?
This is a student.
Oh,
this was a black student who had been on this, she'd been on a committee, so I'd gotten to know her really more personally than I might have, but I also had known her because of her coming to the placement office. And and she was very, she was an active one, and for her to be able to say this, I thought was quite remarkable.
So you were saying that there really was...
So that there was, that during that period, where people were concerned that there'd be more emphasis on opportunities and rights for minorities, the college was involved in this. And
but there were no student riots, is what I was really...
Oh, there weren't riots, no.
In 68, you didn't have the kind of arrest that you...
Well, there wasn't to the same extent. Well, there were... I know that after the Kent State murders, there were marches and pickets. But we didn't have disruption, if that's what you're asking, as there were in some places.
No, I'm just interested because I was never aware that there were any, and I was curious to know if there was something other than what appeared in the public eye, and whether it was because these students were so highly career motivated that they did not take the time or develop the interest. That's all. It's not important, but I was just
Well, exactly. But it gradually touched them, but not to the degree.
Yes,
we didn't have the people locked out of buildings, and it wasn't like at Columbia, and
Right. It's interesting. I'd love to know something about your personal life through all of this. Now, you were working. You were working, and you had a family. So, in a sense, you really are a role model, or could have been a role model.
We didn't have role models in those days.
That didn't exist. Okay.
Now, I've always been a working mother.
Yeah.
I had one daughter, and have, who has produced 3 grandchildren. And remember I said I started at FIT on a part-time basis.
Right.
And the reason I wanted to work part-time was because I was a mother. And I wanted to work if I possibly could. So I designed the hours at that time so that I could have maximum time when you're working also at home. What I found, I said to Mr. Ritter at the time, I'll set my hours from 10 to 2, but no meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really a brilliant thing to say, because you know how much time meetings take up.
Uh-huh.
And I had been in an organization where there were lots of meetings. In fact, I was always there at 9:30 because I dropped my daughter at nursery school, came in, and picked her up at nursery school. But I also had a housekeeper, so she was geared to come if I felt I had to stay later. But what I did after I got home, if I needed to telephone anybody, they didn't know that I was at my own phone.
Yes.
I could do everything but interview students on the phone.
Sure.
So that I would say FIT got more for their money out of me during those part-time days than any time. I probably did 80% of a full-time job. Well, then, as she got a little older, as the need of the job changed, I had to work full-time.
Yes.
And it was a very full-time job and a very satisfying one. And somewhere along the line, a number of years, quite a long time later, back when we got into the 60s, I remarried and acquired 3 stepdaughters.
Oh.
And they all grew and went off to college and moved on to their own normal, healthy adult lives. And I continued working I've always enjoyed my work at FIT. I was well placed at FIT. It was very satisfying to me, and I think it was satisfying to the college to have me, so it was a good connection. And then a revolution happened. I was going to be 60 in 1973, and at that point I would have worked 40 years. No birthday, no set of figures ever hit me until then, and I thought that was pretty amazing. 40 years, and I'm going to be 60. Those are startling figures. I have never not worked since I graduated from college. I've always, I shouldn't have always wondered. I mean, it's always been a different kind of life from the lives of most other women I knew, some of whom who went to work at some point, but were home for a good many years with their children. And so I thought about retiring, and it was a difficult decision in a way because I loved my job, and I was, 60 is young for retiring. But I decided to do it out of curiosity. Why shouldn't I do it when I was young enough and healthy enough to really try it? And I might not like it as well, but I'll never know. So I did. To everybody's great surprise. But what I did do that has recently developed into something that's a very tangible thing now. This was such a revolution to me that I was considering it, that I began secretly to write, to keep a little journal about this. I did it in form of letters to my daughter, letters that were never sent, in which I anticipated
About what year?
about retirement. Well, I can remember the first letter was in August of 1971 when I was in the country thinking about this momentous thing that I was considering, under the pine trees, smelling the beautiful clean air. And so I wrote this first little letter of anticipation. And I did this, I kept this after I retired, a little journal for a while, and then there were little sporadic things over a period of 7 years, just so very secret. My husband didn't know I was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this kind of ambivalent feeling about it, that this was for me, and I would never see the light of day, but also I felt there was something in it that maybe was publishable. And I had ideas for what I would like to do beyond my own personal retirement as far as a book, but I wouldn't do it unless I got a publisher. But all this was very secret. No publisher knew, no agent, nobody knew. And I didn't really want to talk about it because the part that I had written was so personal. I'm not a famous person, so I did not think that any publisher would really want it. And I figured an agent wouldn't either. And so, but this sort of, I'd put it away and then it would come back in my mind. And finally I said to myself, you're supposed to know something about job hunting. Apply this to you. And one of the things that I always say to people is you try everything. So I tried something that is unorthodox. People say you can't get publishers this way, but just like people say you can't get a job by writing to anybody cold, and I say you only need one job. I only needed one publisher. So I went to the Yellow Pages and I called publishers, and with my training on using the telephone to get jobs for people, I'm kind of adroit at getting names out of people and finding out from the telephone operator, buttering up the telephone operator and getting her to give me information. I eliminated some, and then I wrote a letter with just a little statement about what the book was about, and said if they were interested, I would send a partial manuscript. Well, out of that actually came a publisher, and then, once I got a contract, I zoomed ahead, and it only took me 6 months to do the rest of the book, which is 2/3 of the book. But I didn't have a job to do at the time. I didn't have little children to worry about. I could concentrate on it. Lots of interviewing. No tape recorder. It was just interviews and going back and immediately putting it down on paper so I wouldn't forget it. And I'm pleased to say that the book is out. It came out in July, and I just had the pleasure of finding it in the college bookstore.
And what's the name of it?
It's called Retirement, You're in Charge, and the publisher is Praeger.
Okay. P-R-A...
P-R-A-E-G-E-R.
Right. Okay. Well,
It's a very, it's not a how-to book. I have no rules in it, because my theme is that I think each retirement is unique, and each one makes a decision, his decision, her decision, depending on his own personality, his own interests. It's just another slice of life. It's got its low days and its good days, and just like
sounds great. I'll bet you'll have a runaway bestseller, considering
I doubt that.
the number of people who are retiring.
I doubt that it'll be a runaway bestseller. I had a great deal of fun doing it, though.
That's terrific. Yeah, and that's part of the tradition in the sense of FIT, because it seems to me that an awful lot of people at FIT have published books because the material which they wanted to teach simply did not exist in book form.
Well, that wasn't why I did mine. I didn't feel that. Because
yeah.
I had done two other books before, but this was my first personal one.
The other books were on...
The first book I did was because Fairchild Publication asked me if I would do a pamphlet about job opportunities. And I really...
In the fashion markets.
Yeah, I wasn't sure at all I was interested, but I was too embarrassed to say no. I mean, it seemed so unprofessional not to be interested that I went down to talk to the man who was in charge of this. And as we talked, he said, look, I don't want a pamphlet, I want a book. And then I was really stuck, because a book is, you have a job and you want to write a book.
Right.
I didn't. But the summer was coming up, and I faced it with myself and said, what kind of a schmo are you? I mean, why not? And I was very glad I did it. I enjoyed doing it, and again, I was able to do it exactly the way I wanted. I said, I'll do it if I can do it this way.
And what was the title of that?
Is the fashion business your business? And it went in, there have been 3 editions of it, and the third one, which came out in 1970, I guess, 70 or 71, that was really about 50% rewritten. I added, and of course each edition had to be changed, but this was, and it's completely out of date because they wanted, and I understood it, they wanted salaries in it. So it's like looking at ancient history. You should
Fascinating.
find one of those books to discover how some people started on jobs at $40 a week, a good job at $40 a week. But
I believe I started at $37.50 on training squad at Macy's.
yes, but that's because you're so young.
Yes.
But when my job at the New York Times, I started at 20, and if you lasted 2 months, you were raised to 25. And let me tell you, it was probably the highest priced job anybody had who graduated that year. Because when you went to work at Macy's, maybe the Macy's training squad was that. I don't know. But if you were a salesperson, as some of them were, they weren't that.
Yes.
And the other book I did was one I did with a friend, a colleague in England, and that was great fun because that was kind of a hands across the sea, and that's called Starting Work. But this book that I did was my own personal.
Yes.
I mean, that was something I initiated. Both of the other books wanted me to do it, and I enjoyed doing it, but it was a more impersonal thing. But if you ever see the book, the first
The
part
title
of it,
again is
Retirement, You're in Charge, is
a retirement : you're in charge.
yes, is about me. How it really was on a daily basis.
Sounds
Pretty
great.
silly things.
Sounds very good. I think this has really been fascinating.
Well,
thank you very much.
I just hope I haven't told you you're
Not in this one, no. No, it's been really very